In the quiet dawn of December 7, 1941, the world changed forever as the sun rose over a peaceful harbor in Hawaii, and within moments, the sky filled with the roar of hundreds of aircraft bearing the red circle of the rising sun on their wings. Sailors woke to explosions that shattered their ships and their lives, and in less than 2 hours, the waters of Pearl Harbor burned with fire and oil, while thousands of young men who had been sleeping moments before would never see another sunrise. This was not just an attack on a naval base, but the beginning of a collision between two nations whose destinies would become forever intertwined in blood, fire, and ultimately transformation. The story of Japan and America in World War II is not simply a tale of battles and bombs, but a human drama of ambition and fear, of honor and survival, of ordinary people caught in the machinery of history's most devastating conflict. It is a story that begins long before the first bomb fell and continues to echo in our world today, shaping how nations see themselves and each other, teaching lessons about pride and power, about the cost of war and the possibility of peace. This is the entire story of how two nations on opposite sides of the vast Pacific Ocean found themselves locked in a struggle that would consume millions of lives, reshape the world order, and ultimately bind their futures together in ways neither could have imagined when the first shots were fired on that fateful Sunday morning in paradise. To understand how Japan and America came to war, we must journey back to a time when Japan was emerging from centuries of isolation and America was becoming a global power. Japan had spent more than 200 years closed off from the world, refusing contact with foreign nations, and living under the rule of powerful warriors called samurai who served an emperor considered divine by his people. When American warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan in 1853, they forced the island nation to open its doors to trade and contact with the outside world. This moment shocked Japan deeply, showing its leaders that their traditional ways could not protect them from the powerful technologies and weapons that Western nations possessed. The Japanese people, proud and determined, decided they would not become victims of Western imperialism like so many other Asian nations. Instead, they would learn everything they could from the West and become strong enough to stand as equals with the great powers of Europe and America. This decision launched Japan into a period of incredible change called the Meiji Restoration, where the nation transformed itself from a medieval society into a modern industrial power in just a few decades, building factories, railways, a powerful navy, and an army trained in modern warfare. As Japan grew stronger, it looked around at its neighbors and saw opportunities for expansion. The Japanese believed they needed resources and territory to support their growing population and industrial economy. They fought wars with China and Russia, winning both conflicts and surprising the world with their military prowess. When Japan defeated Russia in 1905, it became the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in modern warfare, and this victory filled the Japanese people with immense pride and confidence. Japan began to see itself as the natural leader of Asia, destined to create what they would later call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision where Japan would lead all Asian nations free from Western colonial control. However, this vision of Asian unity under Japanese leadership was really a cover for Japanese imperial ambitions, and the nations that fell under Japanese control would soon discover that Japanese rule could be as harsh or harsher than Western colonialism. During World War I, Japan fought on the side of the Allies and gained German territories in China and the Pacific, expanding its empire further. The Japanese military grew in power and prestige within Japanese society, and the ancient code of the samurai called Bushido, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and fearlessness in the face of death, became intertwined with modern nationalism and militarism. Meanwhile, America was following its own path toward global power. The United States had grown from 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast to a continental nation stretching from ocean to ocean, driven by a belief in manifest destiny that said Americans were meant to spread across the continent. After defeating Spain in 1898, America acquired overseas territories including the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, making it a Pacific power with interests that would inevitably intersect with Japan's growing empire. Americans saw themselves as different from the old European imperial powers, believing they brought democracy, progress, and freedom rather than exploitation, though the people living under American control often had different views about this claim. The United States had tremendous natural resources, a growing industrial economy, and a population swelled by immigrants from around the world seeking opportunity in the land they called the land of the free. American culture celebrated individualism, democracy, and the idea that anyone could rise from poverty to success through hard work, values that contrasted sharply with the Japanese emphasis on hierarchy, group loyalty, and obedience to authority. These cultural differences would make the conflict between the two nations not just a struggle for power, but a clash of completely different worldviews about how society should be organized and what values should guide human behavior. During the 1920s, relations between Japan and America remained generally peaceful despite underlying tensions. Both nations participated in naval limitation treaties that tried to prevent an arms race in the Pacific, and trade between the two countries flourished as Japan sold silk and other goods to America while buying American oil, steel, and machinery. However, beneath this surface cooperation, suspicions and prejudices ran deep on both sides. Many Americans viewed Japanese immigrants with hostility and racism, passing laws that discriminated against Asian immigrants and prohibited Japanese people from becoming American citizens or owning land in some states. These discriminatory laws humiliated Japan and fed resentment among the Japanese people, who saw such treatment as proof that Western nations viewed Asians as inferior despite claims about equality and democracy. Japanese military leaders pointed to American racism as evidence that the Western powers would never accept Japan as an equal and would always seek to keep Asian nations subordinate. On the American side, there was growing concern about Japanese expansion in Asia and fear that Japan threatened American interests, and the principle of the open door in China, which called for all nations to have equal trading rights rather than allowing any single power to dominate. These tensions remained manageable as long as both nations focused on their own affairs. But events in the 1930s would transform underlying suspicions into open hostility and set both countries on a collision course that would end in war. The global economic collapse that began in 1929 with the stock market crash on Wall Street sent shockwaves around the world, and Japan suffered tremendously from what Americans called the Great Depression. Japanese silk exports to America, a major source of income for Japanese farmers, collapsed as Americans could no longer afford such luxuries. Millions of Japanese workers lost their jobs as factories closed, and rural areas faced starvation as agricultural prices plummeted. The Japanese government, led by civilian politicians, seemed unable to solve these economic problems, and many Japanese people lost faith in democracy and parliamentary government. Into this crisis stepped the Japanese military, particularly young officers who believed that Japan's salvation lay in expansion and conquest rather than trade and diplomacy. These officers embraced a radical nationalism that blamed Japan's problems on corrupt politicians, greedy businessmen, and foreign interference. They believed that Japan needed to seize the resources of Asia by force, creating a self-sufficient empire that could survive without depending on trade with Western nations who might cut Japan off at any moment. The military's influence in Japanese politics had always been strong because of constitutional arrangements that gave the army and navy direct access to the emperor and the ability to bring down cabinets by withdrawing their ministers. But now the military began to act independently of civilian control, launching military operations that the government had not approved and assassinating political leaders who opposed their agenda. In September of 1931, officers of Japan's Kwantung Army, stationed in Manchuria to protect Japanese railway interests, staged a false flag incident by blowing up a section of railway track and blaming Chinese forces. Using this manufactured crisis as a pretext, the Japanese army launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, the resource-rich northeastern region of China. The civilian government in Tokyo was shocked and had not authorized this military action, but the invasion proved popular with the Japanese public, and the government found itself unable to rein in the military without risking a domestic political crisis. Within months, Japan had conquered all of Manchuria and established a puppet state called Manchukuo, claiming it was an independent nation, but actually controlling it completely through Japanese advisors and military force. The League of Nations, the international organization established after World War I to prevent future conflicts, condemned Japan's aggression and sent investigators who confirmed that Japan had fabricated the incident that started the war. When the League demanded that Japan withdraw from Manchuria, the Japanese government refused and instead withdrew from the League of Nations entirely in 1933, signaling Japan's rejection of the international order established by the Western powers. This was a turning point that put Japan on a path of isolation and confrontation with the Western democracies, but the success of the Manchurian conquest emboldened the Japanese military to pursue even more aggressive expansion. Throughout the 1930s, the power of the military within Japan continued to grow while civilian control weakened. Young military officers attempted a coup in Tokyo in February 1936, assassinating several government ministers and occupying key buildings in an attempt to establish military rule. Though the coup ultimately failed and its leaders were executed, the incident further intimidated civilian politicians and strengthened the hand of the military in setting national policy. Political parties and democratic institutions withered as Japan moved toward a totalitarian system where the military, the bureaucracy, and industrial cartels called zaibatsu worked together to prepare the nation for total war. The government promoted a propaganda campaign that emphasized Japan's unique national essence called kokutai, centered on worship of the emperor as a living god and complete devotion to the state. School children were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, and that Japan's divine mission was to liberate Asia from Western imperialism and establish Japanese leadership over all Asian peoples. This indoctrination created a population willing to endure enormous sacrifices and prepared psychologically for a war that leaders increasingly saw as inevitable. Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in 1936, ostensibly aimed at opposing communism, but actually representing an alignment with the fascist powers who opposed the democratic Western nations. This alignment worried American observers who saw disturbing parallels between Japanese militarism and the aggressive nationalism of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. In July 1937, another incident at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing provided the spark for full-scale war between Japan and China. What began as a local clash quickly escalated as both sides sent reinforcements, and within weeks Japan had launched a massive invasion of China proper, beyond the Manchurian territories it already controlled. The Japanese military expected to defeat China quickly, believing that Chinese forces were weak and disorganized, and that the Chinese government would negotiate surrender once Japan demonstrated its military superiority. However, the Chinese, despite being outgunned and lacking modern equipment, refused to surrender and continued fighting even after the Japanese captured major cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and the capital Nanjing. The Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months and cost both sides enormous casualties, shocking Japanese leaders who had expected an easy victory. When Japanese forces finally captured Nanjing in December 1937, they went on a rampage of murder, rape, and destruction that lasted for weeks and killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. This atrocity, known as the Rape of Nanjing or the Nanjing Massacre, horrified the world and permanently stained Japan's reputation, revealing the dark side of Japanese military culture that viewed surrender as shameful and treated enemy civilians with brutal contempt. The war in China became a quagmire that consumed vast amounts of Japanese resources and manpower while failing to achieve the decisive victory that would force China to surrender. As years passed with no end to the fighting, Japan found itself bogged down in a conflict it could not win, but would not abandon, draining the nation's strength even as Japanese leaders contemplated further expansion into Southeast Asia to secure the resources needed to continue the war. As Japan's aggression in Asia escalated, the United States watched with increasing concern and disapproval. The American government and public had been shocked by reports of the Nanjing massacre, and missionary groups and journalists who had witnessed Japanese atrocities in China spread stories that turned American opinion strongly against Japan. Americans had long felt a special connection to China, viewing the Chinese as a people Americans were helping to modernize and Christianize, and the image of innocent Chinese civilians being slaughtered by Japanese forces generated genuine outrage. President Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors worried that Japanese expansion threatened not only China but also American interests throughout Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines, an American territory promised eventual independence, lay directly in the path of potential Japanese expansion southward. American businesses had major investments in China and throughout Southeast Asia, and the principle of free trade and equal access that America championed was incompatible with Japan's vision of a closed economic bloc under Japanese control. However, America in the late 1930s was deeply reluctant to become involved in foreign conflicts. Traumatized by the losses of World War I and focused on recovering from the Great Depression, the American public and Congress strongly supported neutrality, and laws passed in the mid-30s prohibited the president from selling arms to nations at war or taking other actions that might draw America into foreign conflicts. Roosevelt walked a careful line between expressing American opposition to Japanese aggression and avoiding actions that might provoke war or violate neutrality legislation. In October 1937, he delivered a speech in Chicago in which he suggested that aggressive nations should be quarantined like diseased patients to prevent the spread of lawlessness. But the negative public reaction to this speech showed how strongly Americans opposed any hint of interventionism. Nevertheless, Roosevelt and his Secretary of State Cordell Hull began taking steps to support China and put pressure on Japan short of actual military action. America extended loans to China and sent military advisors to help the Chinese government. More significantly, the United States refused to recognize the puppet state of Manchukuo or accept Japanese conquests in China, maintaining that the territorial integrity of China must be respected according to international law and treaty obligations. American diplomats repeatedly protested Japanese actions and called on Japan to respect Chinese sovereignty and the principle of the open door. These protests had no practical effect on Japanese policy, but they established an American position that Japan found increasingly insulting and obstructive. Japanese leaders came to see America as the primary obstacle to their plans for dominating Asia, the power that provided resources to China, allowing it to continue resisting, and the moral authority that condemned Japanese actions to the world. The relationship between Japan and America began to deteriorate more rapidly as the 1930s drew to a close. Japanese forces in China repeatedly attacked American citizens, missionaries, and diplomats, claiming these were accidents but showing brazen disregard for American rights. In December 1937, Japanese aircraft attacked and sank the American gunboat U.S. Penne on the Yangtze River in China, clearly seeing the American flags painted on the ship's deck. The Penne was evacuating American diplomats and civilians from Nanjing as Japanese forces approached, and the attack killed 3 Americans and wounded many others. Japan quickly apologized and paid compensation, but the incident showed Americans that Japanese forces would not respect American neutrality and might deliberately target American citizens to intimidate the United States into abandoning China. As war broke out in Europe in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, American strategic thinking began to shift. Roosevelt and military planners recognized that America might eventually be drawn into war against both the fascist powers in Europe and the expansionist Japanese in Asia, and they began gradually preparing for this possibility despite continued public opposition to war. America slowly increased military spending, began building up the Navy and Army, and started working more closely with Britain, which was now fighting for survival against Nazi Germany. The fall of France to German invasion in June 1940 transformed the strategic situation in Asia and gave Japan new opportunities for expansion. France had controlled Indochina, comprising present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and the Netherlands had controlled the East Indies, present-day Indonesia, both territories rich in resources that Japan desperately needed. With France defeated and the Netherlands occupied by Germany, these European colonies were essentially defenseless, and Japan saw an opportunity to seize them and their resources. In September 1940, Japan forced the defeated French government to allow Japanese troops to occupy northern Indochina, giving Japan military bases closer to China and control over supply routes that had been used to send supplies to Chinese forces. This move alarmed the United States because it showed Japan was expanding beyond China and threatened the entire Southeast Asian region. Roosevelt responded by imposing the first significant economic sanctions on Japan, banning the export of aviation fuel and scrap metal that Japan needed for its military. These sanctions angered Japan, but were not yet severe enough to cripple the Japanese economy because America continued to sell Japan the most critical resource of all, oil. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the United States, and without this oil, the Japanese military machine would grind to a halt within months. The oil weapon gave America tremendous leverage over Japan, but using it would force a crisis that could lead directly to war, so Roosevelt hesitated to impose a complete oil embargo, even as tensions continued to rise. In September 1940, Japan made a decision that would have profound consequences for its future relationship with America and the world. The Japanese government signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally creating a military alliance among the three nations that came to be called the Axis powers. The pact stated that if any of the three nations was attacked by a power not currently involved in the European War or the Chinese conflict, the other two would come to its aid. This provision was clearly aimed at the United States, warning America that if it went to war with Germany in Europe or Japan in Asia, it would face war with all three Axis powers simultaneously. Japanese leaders hoped this alliance would deter America from interfering with Japanese plans in Asia, believing that America would not risk a two-ocean war against such powerful enemies. However, the Tripartite Pact had the opposite effect in Washington, convincing Roosevelt and his advisors that Japan was part of a global fascist conspiracy to dominate the world, and that defeating this alliance would require America to eventually fight in both Europe and Asia. The pact ended any remaining possibility of the United States accommodating Japanese expansion in China or Southeast Asia, because doing so would now be seen as appeasing fascist aggression, just as Britain and France had disastrously appeased Hitler before World War II began. The line between America and Japan was now clearly drawn, even if both nations hoped to avoid crossing it into actual war. Throughout 1941, the final year of peace between America and Japan, both nations engaged in increasingly frantic diplomacy while simultaneously preparing for war. In April, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, securing its northern border and freeing resources for potential moves southward into Southeast Asia. Japanese planners had developed a strategy for creating what they called the Southern Resources Area, which would give Japan control over the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of Malaya, and the rice of Indochina, making Japan self-sufficient and able to continue its war in China and resist any Western efforts to pressure Japan economically. However, seizing these territories would mean war with Britain, which controlled Malaya and would not allow its colonies to be taken without a fight, and almost certainly war with the United States, which had made clear it opposed further Japanese expansion and would defend the Philippines. The question facing Japanese leaders was whether to back down from their imperial ambitions and negotiate a settlement with the United States, giving up their conquests in China and their plans for Southeast Asia, or to go to war against the United States and its allies, gambling that Japan could win a quick victory before America's superior industrial power could be brought to bear. This decision would be one of the most fateful in history, determining the course of the war and the future of both Japan and America.